Imagine a creature takes this massive deep breath, opens its scaly jaws, and just exhales a 1600-degree blast furnace. I mean, in mythology, we cheer, right? We watch the movie, we read the book, and we just accept it.
Oh, absolutely. We love the spectacle of it.
Right. But in reality, if you look at that exact same moment through the lens of, hardcore physics, it's a complete nightmare.
It is an absolute evolutionary paradox.
Exactly. Because biological tissue and a 1600-degree flame, well, they just don't mix.
Yeah.
That creature shouldn't be destroying a castle. It should be instantly flash frying its own lungs and literally melting its face off.
Right. It is a profound contradiction.
Mm.
We're comfortable with magic in our stories precisely because we don't have to look at the blueprints. But the moment you strip away the fantasy, the sheer absurdity of it becomes really apparent.
Yeah.
You just can't build a blast furnace out of raw, wet biology.
Yeah.
Or at least that's the baseline assumption.
And challenging that assumption is exactly why you're here with us today. So, welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to scientifically reverse engineer a fire-breathing dragon.
I am very excited for this one.
Me too. Because we are not using magic today, we're throwing out the fantasy tropes entirely. Instead, we are looking at a stack of incredibly dense, real-world data sitting right here on the desk for you.
It's a really fascinating collection of sources we've compiled for you all. We're pulling from speculative evolution forums to set, the conceptual groundwork.
Yeah.
But the heavy lifting is coming from hardcore materials science papers.
Yeah, the ones detailing the sintering of porous thermal insulation ceramics, that stuff is wild.
It really is. And we've also got MIT synchrotron X-ray imaging of actual combusting beetles, which is just incredible. Plus, we're looking at extensive medical data on respiratory heat and moisture loss, and even research on the cellular mechanics of electrohyperthermia.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we want to figure out how a biological apex predator could realistically generate a 1,000-degree chemical payload, survive the internal combustion of that blast, and walk away totally unharmed, we have to tackle the very first glaring hurdle.
Right, the ignition.
Exactly. You don't just strike a match inside a lung. We need a way to make fire out of flesh.
To do that, we need a clear, methodical roadmap. We are basically going to build this creature from the inside out. First, we must identify the fuel.
The chemistry of the spark, right, without any external ignition.
Exactly. Second, we have to understand the physical mechanism of the blast, like how it is actually delivered without destroying the delivery system. Third, we'll dive into the internal heat sinks required to protect the respiratory system from the massive thermal blowback.
Which is going to be intense.
Very. And finally, we have to engineer the external flame-retardant armor.
Okay, let's start with step one, the fuel, the spark. Because if I'm a giant predatory reptile, I don't have a flint and steel in my throat. I can't generate a spark plug's electrical arc organically.
No, you definitely can't.
So I need a chemical mixture that bursts into flame entirely on its own.
Which brings us to the fascinating realm of hypergolic propellants.
Hypergolic propellants.
Right. In rocketry and advanced chemistry, a hypergolic mixture consists of a fuel and an oxidizer that ignite spontaneously the absolute microsecond they come into physical contact.
So literally zero spark required at all.
None whatsoever. The chemical potential energy trapped in the bonds of these two substances is so volatile and they are so reactive with one another that the mere act of mixing them triggers an instantaneous violent combustion.
Wow.
This is actually the exact technology used in the lunar module to get astronauts off the moon.
Wait, really? The Apollo missions?
Yeah, because you don't want to rely on an ignition switch that might fail in a vacuum. You just open two valves, the liquids touch, and boom, you have fire.
That is exactly what a biological flamethrower needs. You keep the two chemicals in separate organic pouches or glands inside the head or the neck, and when you want a fire, you just forcefully squirt them together.
That's the basic mechanical theory, yes.
In the speculative evolution sources we're looking at, people have theorized a few ways a dragon might actually synthesize these rocket fuels organically. And one of the prime candidates they really focus on is hydrazine.
Hydrazine is a very compelling starting point. Its chemical structure is deceptively simple. It's just two nitrogen atoms bonded to four hydrogen atoms.
Which sounds pretty basic.
It is. From a purely biological standpoint, that's incredibly convenient. A dragon could easily acquire the necessary elemental building blocks for hydrazine simply from drinking water and breaking down proteins in a standard carnivorous diet.
But wait, if hydrazine is just nitrogen and hydrogen, why doesn't it just sit there like water or ammonia? Like, what makes it a rocket fuel?
It's all about the instability of the bonds, particularly the nitrogen single bond. It desperately wants to break apart and form an incredibly stable nitrogen gas, and doing that releases a massive amount of energy in the process.
Oh, I see.
However, hydrazine doesn't usually just explode all on its own if it's sitting in a tank. It requires a catalyst to violently and rapidly decompose.
So the dragon needs a trigger, something physical for the hydrazine to touch that sets it off.
Right. In human aerospace engineering, we often use beds of iridium to catalyze hydrazine. But other transition metals work beautifully too, things like ruthenium, rhodium, or even a specific alloy of iron, nickel, and cobalt.
Okay, but for a dragon to utilize hydrazine as a weapon, it would need a biological mechanism to acquire and store these heavy metals inside its airway.
Which is a tall order for a living creature.
It is, but this is where the biology actually supports the fiction. Our sources bring up a real-world behavioral trait called pica.
Oh, pica, yes.
You see this in animals all the time, right? Parrots eating clay, tortoises eating stones, even dogs eating dirt.
They do it to gain trace minerals they can't get from their normal diet.
Exactly. So picture this for you, the listener. Our dragon swoops down, lands in a mountainous region, and actively chews on specific metallic ores.
It swallows them whole.
Yeah, it swallows them. The highly acidic stomach dissolves the rock, and the body transports those trace metals, the iron, the nickel, the cobalt, and deposits them into specialized calcified bony tubes located in the mouth or throat.
So it's a localized biomineralization of catalytic metals.
Exactly. So the dragon pumps the biological hydrazine out of a gland, forces it over these rough, metal-rich, bony ridges, and boom, you get a highly exothermic decomposition right at the exit of the mouth.
It's a very solid theory.
It is. But as cool as that is, I have to say, looking at the data, I vastly prefer the second option our sources suggest.
You're referring to high-test peroxide.
I am, commonly known as HTP. Because hydrogen peroxide is not some exotic rocket fuel we have to bend over backwards to explain, it is something living organisms already produce every single day.
You and I were producing it right now in our cells.
Right. We generate it as a byproduct during the elimination of superoxides. Now, our bodies break it down very quickly because it's actually pretty harmful to us. But what if an organism evolved to not break it down, but to harbor it?
To concentrate it.
Yeah, to stockpile it.
That changes the paradigm completely. Standard household hydrogen peroxide, like the kind you buy in a little brown bottle to clean a scraped knee, is usually about 3% concentration. The rest is just water.
Right.
But if a biological system evolved to distill and concentrate that solution to over 80%, it crosses a major threshold. It becomes high-test peroxide. And at that concentration, it is a terrifyingly potent monopropellant.
A monopropellant meaning it doesn't even need a second chemical to mix with, right? Just a catalyst.
Correct. The decomposition reaction of HTP is staggeringly violent when it is forced across a suitable catalyst. Things like fine silver particles or specific organic enzymes.
And what happens when it hits that catalyst?
The moment it touches the catalyst, the chemical bonds break, and the liquid HTP rapidly and explosively expands into superheated steam and oxygen gas. The volumetric expansion is massive, but the temperature is what's truly devastating.
How hot does it get?
The data indicates this specific reaction reaches between 1,000 and 1,200 Kelvin.
Let's put 1200 Kelvin into perspective for you. That is over 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. Think about the hottest oven in your house. Maybe it hits 500 degrees Fahrenheit on a good day if you're baking pizza. This is more than 3 times hotter than that.
It's an immense amount of heat.
That is a temperature high enough to turn silicate sand into glass. It melts bronze, it melts gold. It might not quite turn solid steel into a puddle, but it is more than enough to instantly incinerate a wooden village or, completely roast a knight inside his armor.
But this immense destructive power raises an incredibly vital question regarding the biological storage of these chemicals.
Oh, absolutely.
We are talking about keeping rocket fuel inside a living, squishy body. Both hydrazine and high-test peroxide are remarkably caustic. Hydrazine is highly toxic, it damages cellular tissue on contact, and acts as an extreme irritant.
And the HTP?
HTP will literally oxidize and destroy any organic matter it touches.
This is where I have to push back on the biology, because this feels like a glaring plot hole in our engineering blueprint here. Well, if I have a literal sack of 80% hydrogen peroxide sitting in my jaw or my chest, how do I not just blow my own head off the second I get a toothache? Or, even simpler, how does this incredibly caustic chemical not just dissolve the very gland that is trying to hold it?
That is the primary engineering bottleneck. You can't just store HTP in a normal biological bladder. It would eat right through the walls in seconds.
Right.
To safely contain something this aggressive, the dragon requires highly specialized biological storage. The sources point us toward a really fascinating work around the concept of a sacrificial mucosal lining.
Sacrificial, like literally throwing cells into a volcano.
In a way, yes. Think about the human stomach for a moment. Your stomach is a sac filled with hydrochloric acid, which is corrosive enough to dissolve metal.
Yeah, that's always wild to think about.
Yet it doesn't digest your own organs. It is protected by a thick mucosal barrier. But the mucus alone isn't enough. The true defense mechanism is that the epithelial cells lining the stomach wall are constantly rapidly dividing and shedding.
Oh, I see. It's a biological arms race.
An arms race of cellular regeneration. Exactly.
Yeah.
The inner wall of the dragon's chemical storage sacs would need to operate on an extreme version of this principle. The tissue must continuously shed and regenerate its outermost layer of cells at a rate slightly faster than the caustic rocket fuel can destroy them.
That's amazing.
It acts as a continuous biological sacrificial layer. The chemicals eat the top layer of cells, breaking them down, but underneath, 3 more layers have already regenerated and pushed upward to take their place.
That is an incredible workaround. The body basically accepts that the container is constantly being destroyed and simply chooses to rebuild it in real time.
Exactly.
But even with sacrificial cell layers, synthesizing and storing liquid rocket fuel inside a living, breathing animal sounds like pure science fiction. It really feels like we are pushing the boundaries of what organic life can actually do.
It does sound extreme.
Which naturally makes you wonder, has nature ever actually pulled off a chemical explosion like this? Have any real animals figured out how to weaponize boiling chemicals without dying in the process?
The answer is yes. And it brings us to a creature that is essentially nature's prototype for our dragon.
We are talking about one of my absolute favorite creatures on Earth, the bombardier beetle.
It's a remarkable insect, usually only 5 to 30 millimeters long, found all over the world.
Yeah.
And despite its size, it has successfully solved the exact thermodynamic and chemical containment problem we were discussing.
Let's look at the chemistry of this little bug because it is staggering. Inside the beetle's tiny abdomen, it has 2 completely separate, specialized fluid reservoirs.
Right.
One holds a chemical called hydroquinone, and the other holds hydrogen peroxide now. Not the 80% stuff our dragon has, but a less concentrated version.
Correct.
When the beetle is threatened by a predator, say, a frog or a spider trying to eat it, muscles forcefully push these 2 precursor chemicals out of their storage sacs and into a thick-walled reaction chamber. And this reaction chamber is heavily lined with highly specialized enzymes.
Those enzymes, specifically catalyses and peroxidases, act as the biological spark. Think of enzymes as highly specific biological machines, or as you might say, molecular scissors.
Molecular scissors, I like that.
The moment the precursor liquids enter the chamber, the catalysts immediately begin snipping apart the hydrogen peroxide molecules, rapidly releasing free oxygen gas and water. Simultaneously, the peroxidases catalyze the oxidation of the hydroquinones.
Wait, what does oxidizing a hydroquinone actually do? Like, what's the end result?
It transforms them into piquinones, specifically a compound called benzoquinone. Benzoquinone is incredibly noxious. It is a highly irritating, toxic, defensive chemical that effectively burns the eyes and respiratory system of any predator.
But the toxic chemical isn't even the main weapon here, right? It's the physical energy of the reaction itself.
Exactly. The transformation of these chemicals releases an enormous amount of exothermic energy. It releases so much heat so rapidly that it literally boils the liquid mixture inside the beetle's reaction chamber.
Boils it inside the bug.
Yes. It brings the fluid to 100 degrees Celsius, 212 degrees Fahrenheit in a fraction of a second, vaporizing roughly a fifth of the liquid instantly.
So inside this tiny bug, you have a violent expansion of boiling steam, toxic chemicals, and oxygen gas. It creates an explosive burst of pressure. It becomes a scalding, boiling chemical spray that the beetle physically shoots out of the tip of its abdomen. You can literally hear an audible popping sound when it fires.
What's truly fascinating here isn't just the chemistry, but the sheer mechanical precision required to survive the physics of the blast. The pressure generated inside that chamber is immense.
I mean, it's essentially a bomb.
It is. Researchers at MIT, working in conjunction with the University of Arizona, realized they needed to see inside a living beetle while it fired to understand why it didn't just rupture like a tiny balloon from the internal pressure and heat.
And how do you look inside a bug that's currently exploding?
You need extraordinary equipment. They took live beetles to the Argonne National Laboratory and used the Advanced Photon Source, a massive incredibly powerful facility to perform high-speed synchrotron X-ray imaging.
Wow.
They were able to capture the internal explosion inside the beetle at an astonishing 2,000 frames per second.
2,000 frames per second just to watch a bug defend itself? That is wild.
Huh?
And what they saw in those X-rays is what we need for our dragon, right? It's a masterpiece of internal plumbing.
It really is. They discovered that the beetle utilizes a purely passive valve mechanism to protect its internal organs.
Wait, what do you mean by passive? Does it just like flex a muscle to close the valve before it shoots?
That's what you might assume, but biological muscles are actually too slow.
Really?
Yes, a nerve impulse takes milliseconds to travel from the brain to the muscle. By the time the beetle's brain registered the explosion and commanded a muscle to close the valve, the pressure would have already blown back into the storage bladders and killed the insect.
Oh man, so it has to be mechanical. It has to be passive.
Driven by the explosion itself. Precisely. The passageway between the delicate reactant storage chambers and the thick-walled explosion chamber contains a flexible biological membrane.
Okay.
As the chemicals mix and the explosion occurs, the massive, instantaneous increase in pressure physically pushes against that membrane. The pressure forces the membrane to expand, physically blocking and sealing the passageway shut.
So the valve closes itself using the very pressure of the blast it's trying to contain.
Exactly.
So the fuel lines are cut off automatically. The explosion has nowhere to go but out the exhaust port.
Yes. The boiling pressurized liquid is forcefully ejected out the back of the beetle. And the moment that fluid is expelled, the pressure inside the reaction chamber suddenly drops back to normal.
And then what happens to the membrane?
Because the pressure's gone, the flexible membrane relaxes back to its original state. The valve reopens, more chemicals flow in from the storage bladders, they hit the enzymes, and the entire process repeats.
And it repeats incredibly fast. That 2,000 frame per second MIT imaging proved something mind-blowing. The beetle doesn't just shoot a single continuous stream of boiling liquid like a garden hose.
No, it doesn't.
It fires in rapid machine gun pulses. Some species of bombardier beetle can release up to 500 individual micro-explosions per second. It's practically a biological buzzsaw of boiling chemicals.
It is incredibly rapid.
And because of this pulsed pressure, the jet is propelled 5 times faster than any other insect's defensive spray.
But if we pause here, this raises an important question regarding the evolutionary strategy.
Oh, like what?
Well, if you are a beetle trying to deter a massive, hungry predator, why wouldn't a continuous, non-stop flamethrower stream be better? A constant stream seems more deterrent than a rapid pulse.
I would assume a continuous stream would drain the fuel tanks too quickly, like it would just run out of ammo.
Fuel management is part of it, certainly, but the primary reason is the thermodynamic limitations of biological tissue. If we connect this tiny beetle to the bigger picture of our massive dragon, the pulsation isn't just a quirky feature of the plumbing, it is a strict thermodynamic necessity.
Okay, walk me through that. Why is pulsing necessary for survival?
The MIT researchers concluded that the microscopic pauses between those 500 pulses per second, those tiny fractions of a millisecond where the chamber is empty before the next blast, give the walls of the reaction chamber critical time to cool down.
Oh, wow. So it's actively managing the heat.
Exactly. Even with a thick-walled chamber, if the beetle fired a continuous stream, the sustained, unbroken exposure to 100 degrees Celsius boiling liquid would overpower the structural integrity of the tissue.
You would just burn through.
Yes, the heat would transfer through the walls into the surrounding vital organs, and the beetle would literally cook itself from the inside out. The mechanical pulsation inherently limits the total thermal load the tissue has to endure.
The beetle is basically feathering the throttle to keep its own engine from melting down. That is brilliant.
It's an elegant solution.
And it translates perfectly to our reverse-engineered dragon. A biologically realistic dragon wouldn't breathe a single long cinematic stream of continuous fire for a minute straight. That would kill it.
It would be fatal, yes.
Instead, it would likely roar out a series of incredibly rapid, pulsating machine gun chemical blasts. It would look like a strobe light of plasma.
It's the only mechanically viable way for biological tissue to manage that kind of exothermic reaction.
But even with pulsation, we have a massive scaling issue here. We are jumping from a bug to a dinosaur. The beetle's spray reaches 100 degrees Celsius, which is the boiling point of water. Our dragon's high-test peroxide blast reaches 1200 Kelvin.
Which is an entirely different universe of thermal stress.
Right. A fraction of a second of pulsation buys the dragon some time, sure, but the sheer radiant heat, just the ambient thermal backwash of exhaling a 1200 Kelvin flame would instantly sear the inside of the dragon's respiratory tract. It wouldn't even need to physically touch the fire. The radiant heat alone would flash fry its lungs. So to survive, the dragon needs more than just a pulse. It needs an active, incredibly powerful cooling system built directly into its airway.
Which brings us to the third phase of our roadmap, the internal heat sinks. Specifically, we need to examine the mechanics of respiratory heat and moisture loss, or RHML.
RHML, okay.
This isn't some speculative biology either. It is an existing evolutionary feature in all mammals, including you and me. But our dragon would need to hyperscale it to an almost industrial degree.
Think about it. Every single time you take a breath, you are exchanging heat with the environment. If you go outside on a cold winter day and breathe on your hands, your breath is warm. You are losing body heat.
That's because mammalian lungs require inhaled air to be at core body temperature and 100% humidity for optimal gas exchange in the alveoli.
So our respiratory tract has to actively condition the air we breathe in, warming and humidifying it on the way down.
And the data on how efficient this is actually pretty shocking.
It really is. Let's look at the data from the ERA study on respiratory heat loss. They discuss a physiological concept called the isothermal saturation boundary.
Yes, the ISB.
This is the point in your airway where the inhaled air has reached perfect temperature and humidity. When a human inhales air, even under extreme sub-zero conditions, say negative 18 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 0 degrees Fahrenheit, the respiratory tract works so efficiently that by the time that freezing air reaches the carina...
That's the point where the trachea splits into the left and right lungs.
Right. By the time it reaches that split, the air has already been warmed to 32 degrees Celsius and fully saturated with moisture.
That is a 50 degrees Celsius temperature swing happening inside a tube only a few inches long in a fraction of a second. It's a perfect biological air conditioner.
It is remarkably efficient. But the mechanism of how the airway cools and warms is what's crucial for our dragon, right?
Exactly. Heat is transferred in the airway through two main physical modalities, dry convection and evaporation. Convection is simply the direct transfer of heat between the flowing air and the surface of the tissue. Think of a fan blowing over a hot pie.
Just moving the heat away?
Right. But evaporation is where the real thermodynamic power lies.
Because turning a liquid into a gas takes a lot of energy.
Correct. As water evaporates from the mucosal surface of the airway to humidify the dry inspired air, it requires latent heat. This latent heat of vaporization doesn't just come from nowhere. It is pulled directly from the surrounding tissue, which significantly cools the airway mucosa.
And the data shows that evaporative cooling vastly overpowers dry convection. Depending on the ambient conditions, the latent heat of evaporation accounts for 70 to 95% of the total respiratory heat loss.
It is a massive percentage.
It's the exact same physics as sweating when you work out. The water evaporating off your skin pulls the heat away. But in this case, the sweating is happening inside the airway.
Now, to understand how a massive dragon could weaponize this principle to survive a 1200 Kelvin backdraft, we have to look at extreme animal adaptations in the real world. You and I are decent at respiratory conditioning, but desert animals are the true masters of heat and moisture management.
The data on the kangaroo rat and the camel is wild. Let's take the kangaroo rat. This tiny rodent lives in the scorching desert and basically never drinks liquid water. It gets all its hydration from eating dry seeds.
It has to conserve everything.
It absolutely cannot afford to lose moisture when it exhales. So it has evolved a nasal structure that allows it to recover 54% of the respiratory water it uses to humidify inhaled air. It catches the water before it leaves its nose.
And the camel takes it even further. A camel can recover up to 70% of its potential respiratory moisture loss. This is how they survive weeks without water in a blistering desert.
But how do they do it? What is the anatomical secret behind this incredible efficiency?
It lies in their nasal turbinates. Turbinates are complex, highly convoluted, scroll-like bony structures located inside the nasal cavity.
They look kind of crazy, right?
They do. They look somewhat like a rolled-up newspaper or a complex fractal maze. And they are covered in highly vascularized mucosal tissue. Their primary evolutionary purpose is to dramatically increase the surface area of the airway.
To give the air more stuff to touch.
Precisely. To put this in perspective, A human has a relatively simple nasal passage with about 12 square centimeters of turbinate surface area. A camel, on the other hand, has an immensely complex nasal cavity with an estimated 1,000 square centimeters of turbinate surface area.
That is an insane amount of surface area packed into a skull. Okay, so let's apply this. Let's build the dragon's internal cooling system.
Yeah.
I want you to picture a dragon's snout. It's not just an empty tube. I want you to compare it to an industrial-grade HVAC radiator coil.
Sure.
It is massive, it is elongated, and it is packed tight with hundreds of thousands of square centimeters of highly complex, convoluted nasal turbinates.
A literal labyrinth of wet mucosal bone.
Exactly. Now, right before the dragon breathes fire, it has a biological pre-cooling phase. It actively pumps fluid, a mixture of water and thick mucus, into these turbinate structures, completely soaking that massive surface area.
So it primes the system.
Yes. Then the hypergolic explosion happens. The hydrazine, or the high-test peroxide, mixes. The 1200 Kelvin fire blasts out of the specialized tubes in the mouth. The intense thermal blowback, the sheer devastating radiant heat, washes backward and hits the respiratory tract.
But it doesn't burn the lungs.
No, because instead of flash frying the delicate lung tissue, that wave of heat hits the soaked turbinates. The thermal energy is instantly absorbed by the latent heat of vaporization as all that mucosal water flashes into steam.
Ah, I see.
The evaporative cooling literally sucks the lethal heat out of the backdraft, protecting the deeper respiratory system.
It's a very elegant application of thermodynamics. But if we look at the physics of that exchange, we run into a severe biological penalty.
What's the penalty?
If the dragon's defense mechanism is to instantly vaporize massive amounts of internal water and just exhale all that steam out into the world, the animal would violently dehydrate itself in a single breath. The water loss required to cool a 1200 Kelvin flame would be catastrophic.
Oh, right.
The dragon might survive the fire, but it would die of desiccation 10 seconds later.
And that is exactly where the camel's trick comes in. The massive surface area of the turbinates isn't just there for evaporation, it acts as a condenser.
A condenser.
Yes. As the superheated, incredibly moisture-dense steam is forced outward by the exhalation, it passes over the distal ends of the turbinates, the parts closer to the nose, which are comparatively cooler.
Oh, of course.
When the hot steam hits the cooler mucosal lining, the steam condenses back into liquid water, clinging to the tissue. It recovers the vast majority of the moisture before it ever leaves the snout.
That's brilliant.
Right. The dragon uses evaporative cooling to block the heat and instantaneous condensation to reclaim the water. It's an almost entirely closed-loop thermal defense system. It barely loses a drop.
The efficiency of such a system is truly remarkable. The evaporative component expertly handles the macro-level heat dispersion, creating a physical buffer of steam. However, we must go deeper. We cannot stop at the macro level.
Deeper into the tissue.
Yes. Even with the best evaporative cooling system in the natural world, it is physically impossible to block 100% of the thermal energy. Some intense heat is inevitably going to penetrate that mucosal layer and reach the actual living cells of the dragon's mouth, throat, and turbinates.
And as we know, biology is incredibly notoriously sensitive to thermal load.
It is.
Right? If you heat up a regular human skin cell too much, it doesn't just get uncomfortable, it literally breaks down on a structural level and dies.
Precisely. Which brings us to the cellular crucible. What happens to the actual meat of the dragon when the heat gets through?
Yeah.
To understand how a dragon could survive this, we need to look at the electrohyperthermia, or MEHT, data.
Okay, the MEHT data.
This research details exactly how living cells react to intense thermal stress. When a cell experiences a severe spike in temperature, its structural integrity is immediately threatened. The proteins inside the cell begin to denature.
What does denaturing actually mean for a cell, like physically?
Think of a protein as a highly specific, intricately folded piece of origami. Its shape dictates its function. Heat adds kinetic energy, causing the atoms to vibrate violently. If the heat is high enough, the protein loses its shape. It essentially unwinds.
So it loses its structure.
Yes. A common analogy is cooking an egg. The clear part of a raw egg is rich in folded proteins. When you introduce heat from a frying pan, those proteins denature, unfold, and tangle together, turning the clear liquid into a white, solid mass.
And the crucial part of that analogy is that you can't uncook an egg. Once those proteins tangle and turn white, they are permanently broken. If that happens inside a cell, the cell loses its machinery and dies.
Exactly. So to prevent this catastrophic unwinding, cells have evolved a defense mechanism. They produce something called heat shock proteins, or HSPs. These are highly specialized stress proteins that act as molecular chaperones.
Molecular chaperones, like they watch over the other proteins.
In a very physical sense, yes. When the temperature of the cellular environment spikes, the cell urgently synthesizes these HSPs. They seek out proteins that are beginning to denature and physically bind to them.
To hold them together.
Yes, they act like biological scaffolds, stabilizing the unfolding proteins, preventing them from tangling with other proteins, and in some cases actively helping them fold back into their proper shape once the heat subsides. If a denaturing protein is like a tangled ball of yarn, the chaperone protein acts as a pair of hands carefully untangling it.
So they're essentially tiny cellular medics that deploy the second the fire alarm gets pulled.
That's a good way to put it.
For our dragon, the cells lining its mouth, its throat, and those massive turbinates would have to be absolute relentless factories for heat shock proteins. They would need to continuously synthesize and secrete membrane HSPs at a staggering rate just to endure the baseline ambient heat of their own fiery breath.
They would be operating at maximum thermal defense capacity constantly. But the HSPs are just the physical armor protecting the protein structures. The real danger of heat, the truly lethal mechanism we must address, is what the thermal load does to the cell's internal communication network.
Specifically the calcium channels.
Yes, the calcium channels.
Okay, this is where the MEHT data gets incredibly specific. Walk us through the communication network.
The data details the function of transient receptor potential channels, commonly known as TRP channels. These are complex transmembrane proteins that sit on the outer envelope of the cell.
Like a gate.
Like a gate, exactly. They act as the primary environmental sensors for cells, detecting things like pressure, chemicals, and, most importantly for us, temperature. Their primary job is to regulate the flow of ions across the cell membrane. And the most critical ion they regulate is calcium.
Calcium. We usually think of it for strong bones, but at the cellular level, calcium is the universal biological messenger, right?
It is the ultimate signaling molecule. The physical state of these TRP channels, whether their gates are open to allow calcium in or closed to block it, is heavily dependent on the ambient temperature.
Oh, so heat directly affects the gate.
It does. The TRPV channels, a specific subfamily of these sensors, shift to an open position when exposed to high temperatures. The heat physically warps the protein, pulling the gate open. And this simple mechanical action dictates the intracellular concentration of calcium.
And the amount of calcium inside the cell is what dictates whether the cell lives or dies. The calcium death switch. Here's where it gets really interesting.
It's a deeply fascinating, somewhat ruthless biological mechanism.
Yeah.
The balance between cell proliferation growing and dividing and apoptosis, which is the biological term for programmed cell suicide, is tightly regulated by this calcium influx.
So it's a delicate balance.
Very delicate.
Yeah.
If a cell has a low, controlled, nanomolar concentration of intracellular calcium, it acts as a positive signal. It actually promotes cell survival. It encourages the cell to divide, proliferate, and repair tissue.
It's the cell's way of saying everything is fine, we have resources, keep growing.
Exactly. But if the environment gets too hot,
Like, say, a 1200 Kelvin flame just passed by.
if the thermal stress is that high, the TRPV channels are forced wide open. They lock into the open position. This causes a massive uncontrolled influx of calcium ions from the extracellular matrix flooding into the cell, pushing the concentration from the low nanomolar level up into the micromolar level.
It overwhelms the system.
It is a lethal signal. The severe calcium overload in the cytosol heavily impacts the mitochondria. It flips a biological switch and triggers apoptosis. The cell's internal machinery essentially decides that the thermal environment is too hostile, the damage is insurmountable, and it initiates a highly organized, programmed suicide sequence. It dismantles itself.
Let's apply this directly to the dragon. If I am a dragon and I roar and breathe a 1200 Kelvin flame, the intense radiant heat is going to instantly spike the temperature of every single cell in my mouth and throat.
Unavoidably.
If I have normal mammalian TRPV channels, that heat is going to force every single microscopic gate wide open. Calcium will violently flood my cells. Every single cell in my mouth will simultaneously receive the signal to commit suicide.
And the result would be catastrophic tissue failure. The tissue wouldn't just burn, it would biologically dismantle itself. It would liquefy into necrotic mush in a matter of hours.
The dragon would survive the physical burn of the fire, only to have its mouth rot out from the inside.
Precisely. Therefore, for a biologically sound dragon to exist, we have to engineer a solution at the molecular level. It must possess heavily mutated TRPV channels.
Mutated how?
These channels would need an incredibly high, almost unprecedented thermal threshold. They must be engineered by evolution to require massively high temperatures, perhaps nearing the boiling point of water, before they physically warp and shift open.
They have to be completely numb to the heat. They have to sit there while the mouth is practically baking, while the mucus is boiling into steam and say, nope, not hot enough yet. Keep the calcium gates closed. Do not pull the suicide switch.
Yes.
It is amazing to think that the concept of a fire-breathing dragon ultimately relies on cellular thermodynamics, that every single time this massive apex predator exhales, its microscopic cells are balancing just on the absolute razor's edge of mass apoptosis, saved from total cellular suicide only by mutant thermal sensors, and a desperate flood of chaperoning stress proteins untangling their biology.
It is a phenomenal symphony of biological resilience. When you look at it through this lens, the inside of the dragon is a thermodynamic fortress. It is wet, it is constantly shedding its sacrificial layers, it is evaporatively cooled by a labyrinth of turbinates, and it is cellularly armored at the molecular level against calcium-induced death.
That is a perfect internal defense system. But that's just the inside. The
Yeah.
inside of the dragon gets the luxury of being wet. The outside of the dragon, the lips, the edge of the snout, the rigid scales on the face, and the chest that are exposed to the direct ambient backdraft of the flame. They can't be wet and mucosal.
No, they are exposed to the dry, open air.
Right. If they were wet, they'd dry out and crack in the sun. So they need an entirely different form of protection. They need to be a literal kiln.
And this brings us to the final, crucial piece of the puzzle, the external flame-retardant armor. To understand how biological scales could withstand the radiant heat of 1200 Kelvin without transferring that heat to the flesh beneath, we must turn to the hard data from our material science research on preparing porous thermal insulation ceramics.
We are looking specifically at research utilizing low-grade potassium feldspar. Now, potassium feldspar isn't some rare exotic meteorite metal. It is a silicate mineral, and it is incredibly common on Earth. It makes up a massive portion of the Earth's crust.
It's everywhere.
And the researchers in this materials science study mixed this common feldspar powder with a specific additive silicon carbide, or SiCy.
The inclusion of silicon carbide is the transformative step. In this context, the SiCy isn't just a structural filler to make the rock harder. It actively functions as a foaming agent.
A foaming agent for rock.
Yes, when you heat this specific mineral mixture up to extreme temperatures, something remarkable happens at the chemical level. It undergoes sintering.
Walk us through the sintering process, because it sounds like melting, but it's not quite melting, right?
That's a crucial distinction. Sintering is the process of compacting and forming a solid mass of material by heat or pressure, but crucially, without melting it to the point of total liquefaction. It enters a viscous, sticky phase.
Okay, so it's gooey, but not liquid.
Exactly. The study found that when this potassium feldspar and silicon carbide mixture is baked at exactly 1250 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes, a specific chemical reaction occurs. The sickiness oxidizes. As it oxidizes, it releases carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide gases directly inside the viscous, semi-molten phase of the feldspar.
It literally foams up, like yeast releasing gas when you bake bread, causing the dough to rise and form air pockets. But instead of soft dough, we are talking about molten rock.
Yes, a geological baking process. And as this foamed, viscous mineral cools and hardens back into a solid, it creates a highly specific, engineered internal architecture. It forms a dense, regular structure of closed pores.
Closed pores, meaning the bubbles don't connect.
Right. We're talking about millions of tiny, microscopic bubbles of static air permanently trapped inside a solid ceramic matrix.
And this specific structure, the closed pore ceramic, is a thermodynamic miracle. It is the ultimate heat shield. The researchers tested this material, and the resulting ceramic has a thermal conductivity of just 0.072 watts per meter Kelvin.
To contextualize how low that number is, solid copper, which is an excellent conductor of heat, is around 400 watts per meter Kelvin. Even solid wood is around 0.15. The ceramic is at 0.072. It is astonishingly low. It is an almost perfect thermal insulator.
But why? I think a lot of people assume a solid wall blocks heat better than a wall full of holes. Why does trapping microscopic air bubbles in rocks stop heat from passing through it?
To understand that, we have to visualize how heat physically transfers at the atomic level. Heat conduction in a solid relies entirely on the kinetic thermal vibration of atoms. One atom gets hot, it vibrates violently, it physically bumps into the next atom, transferring the kinetic energy, and that wave of vibration passes through the material.
Like a microscopic game of dominoes.
Precisely. But when that wave of atomic vibration traveling through the solid ceramic hits a pocket of air, one of those microscopic closed pores, it hits a dead end.
Because there's no solid matter to bump into.
Exactly. It cannot easily cross the empty gap. The atomic density of a gas is incredibly low, so the heat transfer capacity is significantly lower than in the solid rock. The heat wave is forced to stop, change direction, and travel around the perimeter of the pore, navigating a much longer, highly tortuous path through the incredibly thin, solid walls separating the bubbles.
So the heat literally gets lost in a... And the craziest part about this data is that it isn't fragile. You'd think a rock full of millions of microscopic bubbles would crumble if you stepped on it or hit it with a sword. But even though it's essentially rock foam, this closed-pore ceramic yielded a compressive strength of 3.429 megapascals.
It is incredibly tough.
It really is. And vital for a living creature, it has an incredibly low water absorption rate of only 13.5%. Meaning, if the dragon flies through a rainstorm, its armor won't soak up water, become heavy, and lose its thermal insulation properties.
If we synthesize this material's science data with biological processes, we have the perfect, scientifically sound model for dragon scales. A fire-breathing dragon scales wouldn't be like fish scales or even standard reptile scales made of keratin, like your fingernails.
Because keratin would just burn right off.
Exactly. There would be highly advanced biological biomineralizations of feldspar and silica.
The dragon's body naturally absorbs these minerals from its environment, processes them, and extrudes a dense outer layer that acts exactly like this closed-pore ceramic foam.
Through biological sintering.
Yeah, the biological sintering process, perhaps utilizing the animal's own baseline body heat, combined with specific enzymatic reactions, creates a lightweight, incredibly tough, essentially heat-proof armor covering its face, chest, and vital areas.
It is the ultimate biological heat shield. The radiant heat from the 1200 Kelvin flame hits the face, but the thermal energy is trapped in the microscopic maze of the closed pores, never reaching the living flesh beneath the scales.
It is flawless. But I have to be honest, as I was reading through the sintering data, I found a vulnerability.
Oh.
Yeah, I found a distinct flaw in the armor, and it's a flaw that puts a hard limit on our dragon.
You're referring to the temperature and time thresholds of the sintering process.
I am. The researchers found that creating and maintaining the ceramic foam is incredibly delicate. 1250 degrees Celsius was the absolute sweet spot to maintain the closed pores. But the data shows that if the temperature spikes just a tiny bit higher, up to 1290 degrees Celsius, or if it is exposed to the heat for too long, say 60 minutes instead of 30, the entire internal structure fails catastrophically.
It's a matter of viscosity. At 1290 degrees, the extreme heat lowers the viscosity of the semi-molten rock too much. It becomes too fluid.
Right. And when it gets too fluid, those beautiful, independent, microscopic bubbles of air can't hold their shape. The thin ceramic walls between them melt away, and the closed pores start to merge together. They form large, interconnected through holes. The structural integrity of the maze collapses.
And when the pores interconnect, the physical properties change entirely. The air is no longer static or trapped. Convection currents can easily form and flow through the new, larger channels, and the thermal insulation property of the ceramic is completely destroyed.
Because the maze is gone.
Exactly. The heat no longer has to navigate a maze. It rushes right through the material via convection.
Which means, from a biological standpoint, a dragon has a strict, inescapable mathematical thermal limit. A dragon cannot just hover over a castle or a battlefield and breathe a continuous stream of fire endlessly for 20 minutes.
It's impossible.
If they sustain the hypergolic blast for too long, or if the ambient heat of the battlefield spikes their external temperature too high, their own biological ceramic scales will reach that critical 1290-degree threshold.
The internal pore structure of their facial armor will literally melt and collapse.
The thermal conductivity will skyrocket, the heat will bypass the insulation, and the radiant heat of your own weapon will cook the flesh right off their skull. It gives the dragon a mandatory biological cooldown period. They have to stop firing. They have to let the scales shed the accumulated heat into the air, or they die by their own fire.
It's a fascinating limitation. It grounds the fantasy in a beautiful, brutal, physical reality. It's an exquisite evolutionary balance of immense offensive power weighed against structural vulnerability.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at a creature of pure myth, a monster that supposedly defies all logic and biology. But by breaking it down step by step, by pulling together the rocketry of hypergolic propellants like HTP, the passive pulsating mechanical microvalves of the tiny bombardier beetle, the incredible HVAC evaporative engineering of camel turbinettes, the calcium channel survival mechanisms of heat shock cells, and the closed-pore biomineralization of feldspar ceramics. Well, we haven't just debunked a myth, we've built a machine.
We have proven that the concept is mathematically and biologically feasible. A dragon isn't a magical flamethrower. It is a breathtaking masterpiece of thermodynamics. It is an apex predator functioning as a living kiln, constantly precariously balancing its lethal thermal output against its own cellular and structural integrity.
The convective cooling required to keep its internal lungs from melting works in perfect, synchronized tandem with the ceramic-grade insulation found in its calcified external scales.
It's an entire self-contained ecosystem of heat management. The biological landscape we started with might have seemed murky and impossible, but the physics we've uncovered here are crystal clear.
They really are.
And this raises an important question, something I want to leave you, the listener, to mull over long after we sign off.
Okay, let's hear it.
If we can conceptually reverse engineer this level of thermal perfection, if we can theorize that nature could evolve this precise sequence of chemical and mechanical mastery to protect an organism from a 1,000-degree blast, why couldn't we apply it?
Apply it to what?
Could we use the blueprint of this imaginary dragon to engineer the next generation of real-world aerospace technology? Imagine self-healing bioceramic heat shields for spacecraft that don't just deflect heat, but actively sweat, evaporate, and regenerate during the extreme thermal stress of atmospheric reentry.
Perfectly mimicking the sacrificial mucosal layers and porous, biomineralized scales of a dragon.
Exactly. The myth we've been analyzing today might just hold the key to the future of human material science.